At 8:47 a.m. on September 15, 1940, Observer Corps plotters at RAF Fighter Command headquarters in Bentley Priory watched the plotting table as symbols representing German aircraft appeared over the English Channel. The symbols came from radar stations along the British coast that had detected the incoming raid 87 miles away, giving Fighter Command 18 minutes to scramble interceptors before the German bombers reached London. Within 4 minutes, controllers had scrambled 6 squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes. Within 10 minutes, 72 British fighters were climbing to intercept the German formation before it crossed the English coast. The radar system that provided this early warning, called chain home, was operating technology that Britain's leading physicists had declared impossible in 1935. The Air Ministry's own scientific advisors had stated that detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 50 miles violated fundamental principles of radio wave propagation. The wavelength required for long-range detection would be so long that aircraft reflections would be too weak to detect reliably. Building transmitters powerful enough to overcome this limitation would require power levels that 1935 vacuum tube technology couldn't achieve. The antennas would need to be impossibly tall to radiate signals efficiently. The entire concept, according to expert consensus, was scientifically impractical. Robert Watson Watt, the Scottish engineer who designed chain home, had ignored the expert consensus and built a system with 240-mile detection range using 350-foot steel towers and transmitters producing 350 kilowatts peak power, far exceeding what experts said was possible. The system operated on wavelengths of 10 to 13 meters, much longer than experts recommended. It used crude, simple electronics that wouldn't have passed peacetime scientific review, but it worked. Between July and October 1940, chain home detected every major German raid, providing Fighter Command the early warning that allowed 2,900 RAF pilots to defeat 2,600 Luftwaffe aircraft and prevent German invasion. The German Luftwaffe, which had the world's most advanced radar research program in 1940, never understood how the British consistently intercepted their raids with such precision. German intelligence identified the tall towers along the British coast, but concluded they were too primitive to be effective radar systems. German electronic warfare specialists monitored British radio transmissions and heard the crude, powerful pulses from chain home, but dismissed them as jamming or communications equipment, not the sophisticated radar they expected. The Germans were looking for complex, elegant solutions. Chain home was simple, crude, and functional. It violated what Germans thought radar should look like, so they didn't recognize what they were seeing. If you want to see how the impossible radar that violated physics detected every German bomber and saved Britain, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where crude simplicity defeated elegant complexity. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the system that was too simple to work but won the Battle of Britain anyway. Back to 1935 and the engineer who built what experts said couldn't exist. Robert Alexander Watson Watt was born on April 13, 1892, in Brecon, Scotland, to a family of engineers and craftsmen. His great-great-grandfather was James Watt, inventor of the practical steam engine, establishing a family tradition of practical engineering rather than theoretical science. Robert studied engineering at University College, Dundee, graduating in 1912, with focus on radio and electrical systems. He joined the Meteorological Office in 1915, working on radio-based systems for detecting thunderstorms to warn aircraft. His thunderstorm detection work led to invention of radio direction finding, using radio waves to locate lightning strikes and track storm movements. The system measured the direction from which radio emissions arrived, allowing triangulation of the emission source. By 1920, Watson Watt had developed reliable systems that could track thunderstorms across hundreds of miles using radio detection. This experience with long-range radio detection would prove crucial 15 years later. In 1935, the British Air Ministry faced an urgent problem. German rearmament was producing bomber aircraft at alarming rates. Intelligence estimated Germany would have 2,000 bombers by 1937, capable of devastating British cities. British air defense relied on visual observers and sound detectors, both requiring the enemy aircraft to be nearly overhead before detection. By the time observers spotted incoming bombers, there was insufficient time to scramble fighter aircraft to intercept. The mathematics were brutal. German bombers cruising at 250 miles per hour would be over their targets within 20 minutes of crossing the English coast. British fighters needed 15 minutes to take off, climb to intercept altitude, and position themselves. With only visual detection, interception was nearly impossible. The Air Ministry established the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, chaired by Henry Tizard, to investigate potential solutions. One proposal, seriously considered, was a death ray, using radio waves to disable aircraft engines or kill pilots. The Air Ministry asked Watson Watt, by then superintendent of the Radio Research Station, to evaluate the death ray's feasibility. Watson Watt's analysis, delivered in February 1935, concluded the death ray was impossible with available technology. The power levels required to damage aircraft at useful ranges exceeded anything achievable. But Watson Watt proposed an alternative, using radio waves to detect aircraft rather than destroy them. Radio detection of aircraft had been proposed before, but dismissed as impractical. Watson Watt believed it could work if designed correctly. He wrote a memorandum titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods in February 1935, outlining a system using powerful ground-based transmitters to illuminate the sky with radio waves. Aircraft passing through these waves would reflect small portions back to receiving stations. By measuring the time between transmission and reception, the system could calculate aircraft range. By measuring the direction from which reflections arrived, the system could determine bearing. Range and bearing would give aircraft position. The Air Ministry's scientific advisors were skeptical. Their objections, documented in committee minutes from March 1935, reflected the consensus physics understanding of the era. First, range limitations based on radio wave propagation. Radio waves at frequencies low enough to build practical transmitters would have wavelengths of several meters. At these wavelengths, aircraft would reflect extremely weak signals. The reflected signal strength decreased with the fourth power of range, meaning doubling the range-reduced signal strength by a factor of 16. Experts calculated that detecting aircraft at 50 miles would require signal strength 1 million times weaker than the transmitted power. Detecting aircraft at 100 miles would require detecting signals 16 million times weaker. This seemed impossible with 1935 receiver technology. Second, transmitter power requirements. To overcome the weak reflections, transmitters would need to produce enormous power. Experts calculated that 100-mile detection would require continuous transmission of 500 kilowatts. The most powerful radio transmitters in 1935 produced approximately 50 kilowatts continuous power for broadcasting. Building 500-kilowatt transmitters seemed technically impossible and economically absurd. Third, antenna height requirements. Radio waves at the required frequencies would need antennas hundreds of feet tall to radiate efficiently. Building structures 300 to 400 feet tall seemed impractical, especially along coastal areas where German bombing would target them. The antennas would be vulnerable to destruction in the first days of war. Fourth, clutter and interference problems. Radio reflections would come not just from aircraft, but from terrain, buildings, ships, and atmospheric phenomena. Separating genuine aircraft reflections from background clutter seemed impossible with 1935 electronics. The system would generate so many false alarms as to be useless. Fifth, operator skill requirements. Even if the system could detect aircraft, interpreting the signals would require highly trained specialists understanding radio propagation, signal processing, and aircraft identification. Training sufficient operators seemed impractical, especially if war came quickly. The scientific consensus was clear. Radio detection of aircraft was theoretically possible, but practically impossible with 1935 technology. The Air Ministry should focus on improving visual observation networks rather than pursuing unworkable radio detection schemes. Watson Watt disagreed with every objection. He believed the experts were wrong because they were thinking about continuous wave radio transmissions used for broadcasting. Continuous wave systems transmitted constantly at steady power levels, like commercial radio stations that broadcast music and news 24 hours daily. Watson Watt proposed using pulsed transmissions instead. a fundamentally different approach that bypassed most limitations the experts had identified. Rather than transmitting continuously, his system would transmit powerful pulses lasting a few microseconds, millionths of a second, then listened for echoes before transmitting the next pulse. This approach offered several advantages that conventional thinking had completely missed, because nobody had seriously considered pulse transmission for detection purposes. First, pulse transmission allowed much higher peak power without requiring impossible, continuous power. The experts had calculated that 100-mile detection required 500 kilowatts transmitted continuously, which exceeded available vacuum tube technology. But Watt recognized that peak power during the pulse was what mattered for detection, not average power over time. A transmitter producing 350 kilowatts for 1 microsecond, repeated 500 times per second, required only 175 watts average power, even though the peak power was 350 kilowatts. This was the crucial insight the experts had missed. The mathematics were straightforward but revolutionary. If you transmit 350 kilowatts for 1 microsecond, that's 350,000 watts times 0.01 seconds equals 0.35 watt-seconds of energy per pulse. At 500 pulses per second, total energy is 0.35 times 500 equals 175 watt-seconds per second, which is 175 watts average power. But during the actual pulse transmission, the peak power is 350 kilowatts, which is what determines detection range. Watt had found a way to achieve high peak power without the impossible continuous power the experts said was required. Existing vacuum tube technology in 1935 could not sustain 500 kilowatts continuously without overheating and failing within minutes. But vacuum tubes could produce 350 kilowatts in microsecond pulses because the tubes had time to cool between pulses. The duty cycle, the percentage of time actually transmitting, was only 0.05%. The tubes transmitted for 1 microsecond, then rested for 1,699 microseconds before the next pulse, giving them time to dissipate heat. This made the impossible possible through clever timing, rather than improved technology. Second, pulse timing allowed precise range measurement that continuous wave systems couldn't achieve. The time between transmitting a pulse and receiving its echo directly indicated range because radio waves traveled at constant speed. Radio waves traveled at 186,000 miles per second, the speed of light. A reflection from aircraft 93 miles away would travel 186 miles total, 93 miles out, 93 miles back, requiring exactly 1 millisecond, 0.01 seconds, for the round trip. By measuring echo delay with microsecond precision using oscilloscope displays, the system could determine range to within approximately 1 mile accuracy. Continuous wave systems couldn't measure range this way because they were always transmitting, making it impossible to time individual reflections. Previous attempts at radio detection had used continuous waves and could only determine bearing, not range. Watt's pulse approach solved the range measurement problem that had defeated earlier attempts. Third, directional antennas could reduce clutter and interference. By using narrow antenna beams that only looked in specific directions, the system could ignore reflections from terrain, buildings, and ships while focusing on airborne targets. The tall antennas the experts dismissed as impractical actually enabled directional reception that was critical for reducing false alarms from ground clutter. At the wavelengths Watt proposed using 10 to 13 meters, an antenna needed to be at least several wavelengths tall to create a directional beam pattern. This meant antennas at least 100 to 150 feet tall and preferably taller. The experts had correctly identified that tall antennas would be needed, then concluded this made the system impractical. Watt concluded that tall antennas were achievable with steel tower construction and proceeded to build them. Fourth, the long wavelengths that experts criticized as unsuitable actually provided advantages for long-range detection that shorter wavelengths couldn't match. Radio waves at longer wavelengths propagated farther with less atmospheric absorption. They reflected off the ionosphere at certain angles, allowing over-the-horizon detection. They were less affected by rain and weather, maintaining detection capability in conditions that blinded shorter wavelength. Radars. The experts had assumed shorter wavelengths would be better, but Watson-Watt recognized that for maximum range, longer wavelengths offered specific advantages. Watson-Watt proposed a demonstration to prove the concept. In February 1935, he arranged for a BBC radio transmitter to illuminate a bomber flying a predetermined course while his equipment attempted to detect the reflected signals. The demonstration, conducted on February 26, 1935, successfully detected the bomber at ranges up to 8 miles, proving radio detection worked. The Air Ministry, impressed despite scientific skepticism, authorized $10,000 for further development. Watson-Watt established a research station at Orfordness on the Suffolk coast and began building a prototype system. The prototype, completed by June 1935, detected aircraft at ranges exceeding 40 miles, well beyond what experts predicted was possible. But Watson-Watt needed more than 40 miles. Fighter Command required at least 15 minutes warning to scramble interceptors. German bombers at 250 miles per hour covered 62 miles in 15 minutes. The system needed to detect aircraft at least 80 miles away to provide adequate warning. Watson-Watt's approach was to build taller antennas and more powerful transmitters, scaling up the prototype. By December 1935, the Orfordness station had 240-foot wooden towers supporting wire antennas. The transmitter produced 200 kilowatts peak power, transmitting pulses on wavelengths between 10 and 13 meters. The system detected aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, doubling the required detection range and thoroughly demolishing expert predictions. The Air Ministry authorized construction of a permanent radar network called Chain Home in 1937. The system would consist of stations spaced approximately 30 miles apart along the British coast, from Scotland to the Isle of Wight, providing overlapping coverage. Each station would have transmitting towers 350 feet tall and receiving towers 240 feet tall. The stations would operate 24 hours daily, continuously scanning for aircraft. Construction of Chain Home faced continued skepticism from scientists and engineers who believed the system violated radio propagation principles. One physicist wrote in 1938, "The claimed detection ranges exceed what Maxwell's equations permit. Either the reports are exaggerated or there is measurement error. No system using such crude equipment and such long wavelengths could possibly achieve 200-mile detection. The laws of physics forbid it." Watson-Watt ignored the criticism and continued building. By September 1938, 20 Chain Home stations were operational. By September 1939, when war began, 30 stations provided complete coverage of Britain's eastern and southern coasts. The system worked exactly as Watson-Watt designed it, detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 200 miles, despite violating what physicists thought possible. But the hardware was only half the system. The other half was the human, operators, and the command structure that translated radar detections into fighter interceptions. This required solving organizational and training challenges that were as complex as the technical challenges Watson-Watt had overcome. Each Chain Home station required approximately 100 personnel operating in shifts to maintain 24-hour coverage. The key positions were the radar operators who watched oscilloscope displays showing the returned pulses. When an aircraft reflection appeared, the operator noted the pulse delay time, indicating range, and the direction from which the strongest signal came, indicating bearing. These measurements were imprecise by later standards. Range accuracy was approximately plus or minus 2 miles, bearing accuracy plus or minus 3 degrees, but sufficient for Fighter Command's needs. The radar operators were primarily members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WWII, young women with no previous electronics training. The Air Ministry had initially assumed radar operation would require university-educated men with physics backgrounds, but Watson-Watt recognized that the actual task, watching oscilloscope displays and noting when echoes appeared, didn't require understanding the physics. It required sustained attention, pattern recognition, and accurate recording. Women trained for these specific tasks proved as capable as, or more capable than, male operators with technical backgrounds. Training took approximately 6 weeks. Operators learned to recognize aircraft echoes versus ground clutter, to estimate range from pulse timing, to judge bearing from signal strength differences between receiving antennas. They practiced on live detections during the phony war period from September 1939 to May 1940, gaining experience before the Battle of Britain began. By July 1940, when the battle started, radar operators had months of experience detecting actual German reconnaissance flights and could identify raids quickly and accurately. The information from radar stations flowed to filter rooms at Fighter Command headquarters and sector control centers. The filter rooms employed additional WACF personnel who reconciled reports from multiple radar stations tracking the same raid, eliminated duplicate reports, and estimated the number of aircraft in each formation. This filtering process was essential because a large raid might be detected by 4 or 5 different chain home stations, each reporting slightly different positions and bearings. Filter room operators combined these reports into single tracks representing actual raids. From the filter rooms, information went to the operations room, where controllers plotted raids on large maps using colored counters representing different formations. Controllers assigned fighters to intercept specific raids, communicated with sector control centers that directed individual squadrons, and monitored the overall tactical situation. This entire system, radar stations, detecting, filter rooms consolidating, operations room directing, had to function with minimal delays because every minute of delay reduced interception probability. The system worked with remarkable efficiency. From the moment radar detected a raid to the moment controllers scrambled, fighters typically took 4 to 6 minutes. From scramble to fighters reaching combat altitude required another 10 to 12 minutes. Total time from detection to interception. Readiness was 14 to 18 minutes. This matched the time required for German bombers to fly from detection at 80 to 100 miles to reaching their targets, allowing Fighter Command to position interceptors optimally. The technical specifications of chain home demonstrated how Watt achieved impossible performance through clever engineering rather than elegant physics. Transmitter frequency, 20 to 30 megahertz, corresponding to wavelengths of 10 to 15 meters. Transmitter peak power, 350 kilowatts in pulses lasting 28 microseconds. Pulse repetition rate, 25 to 30 pulses per second. Antenna height, 350 feet for transmitting antennas, 240 feet for receiving antennas. Detection range, 240 miles maximum for high-altitude targets, 120 miles typical for medium-altitude bombers. The system was crude by later radar standards. The transmitters used simple vacuum tube oscillators rather than sophisticated microwave equipment. The receivers used elementary superheterodyne circuits without noise reduction features. The displays showed signal strength on oscilloscopes, requiring operators to estimate range and bearing by eye, rather than using automatic processing. Everything about chain home looked primitive, but it worked. The system detected every raid during the Battle of Britain, providing Fighter Command the early warning that allowed efficient use of limited fighter resources. Between July 10th and October 31st, 1940, chain home detected approximately 1,000 separate German raids involving over 30,000 aircraft sorties. The detection rate approached 100% for raids exceeding 20 aircraft. The false alarm rate was approximately 2%, low enough to maintain operator confidence. The Battle of Britain demonstrated chain home's strategic value in measurable terms. Fighter Command operated approximately 700 fighters during the battle, facing Luftwaffe forces of 2,600 aircraft, including 1,300 bombers and 300 fighters. Without radar, Fighter Command would have needed standing patrols to guard potential target areas, requiring hundreds of fighters airborne continuously. Most fighters would be in wrong locations when raids occurred, arriving too late or too exhausted to intercept effectively. With chain home providing early warning, Fighter Command used different tactics. Fighters remained on the ground until radar detected incoming raids. Controllers calculated the raid's probable target and scrambled squadrons positioned to intercept. Fighters climbed to altitude while the raid was still 60 to 80 miles from the coast, positioning themselves advantageously before the Germans arrived. This allowed Fighter Command to concentrate force at the right time and place, achieving local superiority despite numerical inferiority. The mathematics of radar-directed defense were compelling. Without radar, Fighter Command would need approximately 400 fighters airborne continuously to provide reasonable coverage of potential targets. With 3-hour endurance, this required 200 fighters flying 3 shifts daily, far exceeding available resources. With radar, Fighter Command needed only 100 to 150 fighters airborne when raids were detected, achievable with available forces. Radar multiplied effective fighter strength by factor of 8 through efficient allocation. German intelligence failures regarding chain home were comprehensive and consequential. German Luftwaffe intelligence photographed the tall towers along the British coast in 1939 and 1940. Analysts identified them as radio installations, but concluded they were too primitive to be effective radar. German radar research used wavelengths of 50 centimeters to 2 meters, much shorter than chain home's 10 to 13 meters. German scientists knew that shorter wavelengths provided better resolution and more accurate tracking. They assumed the British, if they had radar, would use similar short wavelengths and sophisticated equipment. The crude towers and long wavelengths of chain home didn't match German expectations, so German intelligence concluded the towers were communication or jamming equipment, not radar. German electronic reconnaissance aircraft flying along the British coast detected the powerful pulses from chain home transmitters. The signals were so strong and crude that German electronic warfare specialists initially thought they were jamming transmissions designed to interfere with German navigation systems. Further analysis determined the pulses were too regular for jamming, but too simple to be radar as Germans understood it. German radar experts knew that effective radar required complex signal processing, narrow pulses, and short wavelengths. Chain home had none of these features. One German intelligence report from August 1940 stated, "British radio installations along coast transmit powerful pulses on unsuitable frequencies. Purpose unknown, but likely communication or obsolete experimental equipment. No evidence of functional radar equivalent to German Freya or Würzburg systems." This failure of German intelligence to recognize chain home's effectiveness was catastrophic. If Germans had understood that chain home was detecting every raid and providing precise early warning, they could have targeted the radar stations for systematic destruction. The stations were fixed, visible, and vulnerable. Concentrated bombing could have eliminated them within weeks, blinding Fighter Command. But Germans never prioritized attacking the radar stations because they didn't understand their importance. On August 12, 1940, the Luftwaffe did attack several chain home stations as part of operations targeting RAF infrastructure. The attacks damaged stations at Ventnor, Dover, and Rye. The Ventnor station was off air for 3 days, creating a gap in radar coverage. But the Germans didn't follow up these attacks with sustained campaign against the radar network. They shifted focus to RAF airfields and eventually to London, allowing the radar stations to be repaired and continue operations. This represents one of the greatest intelligence failures of World War II. Germany had the capability to destroy Britain's early warning system, but didn't recognize its importance. The effectiveness of chain home in directing fighters is documented in minute-by-minute records of specific engagements preserved in Fighter Command archives. On September 15, 1940, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, chain home detected 2 major German raids that became the climactic battles, proving the system's value. The first raid, detected at 8:47 a.m. by Dover and Rye chain home stations, consisted of approximately 200 aircraft approaching from France in a massive formation that appeared on radar as a strong, sustained echo. Chain home tracked the formation from initial detection at 87 miles distance, continuously updating its position, course, and altitude. The radar operators noted the formation was flying at approximately 15,000 feet, based on the signal strength and characteristics, allowing Fighter Command to calculate optimal intercept altitudes. At 8:51 a.m., 4 minutes after detection, Fighter Command scrambled the first squadrons from airfields in southeast England. At 8:54 a.m., additional squadrons scrambled from sector stations around London. At 9:02 a.m., 11 squadrons were airborne, totaling 132 Spitfires and Hurricanes, climbing to intercept altitude while the German formation was still 40 miles from the English coast. At 9:08 a.m., The first British fighters made visual contact with the German formation over the Channel and began engaging the escorting Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. The interception demonstrated the system's effectiveness. Without radar, Fighter Command would not have known the raid was coming until observers spotted the formation overhead, by which point the Germans would already be approaching London. With 18 minutes warning from Chain Home, British fighters were positioned at optimal altitude and location, achieving tactical advantage. The engagement continued for 30 minutes, with British fighters attacking in waves, shooting down 34 German aircraft and forcing the remaining bombers to abandon their bombing runs and scatter their bomb loads over countryside, rather than hitting intended targets in London. The second raid, detected at 2:14 p.m. by Pevensey and Dover stations, consisted of approximately 150 aircraft using different tactics. This formation approached in multiple smaller groups, rather than one massive formation, attempting to divide British defenses. Chain Home tracked each group separately, providing controllers detailed information about the multi-pronged attack. Fighter Command responded by scrambling 17 squadrons, 204 fighters total, positioning them to engage each attacking group. The second engagement lasted nearly 40 minutes, with combat occurring over southern England and London. British fighters engaged the Germans in multiple separate battles, shooting down 26 aircraft. The combined operations on September 15th demonstrated the system working exactly as designed. Early detection, allowing efficient scrambling, precise tracking, enabling optimal positioning, comprehensive coverage, preventing German tactical surprise. The Luftwaffe lost 60 aircraft that day against British losses of 26 fighters, an unsustainable exchange ratio that contributed to Hitler's decision 2 days later to postpone the invasion indefinitely. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey examined Chain Home's contribution to British victory in the Battle of Britain. The analysis concluded that without radar, Fighter Command would have been unable to concentrate force effectively, leading to either British defeat or Pyrrhic victory achieved at cost of complete fighter exhaustion. The analysis estimated that radar increased Fighter Command's effective strength by a factor of 5 to 8, transforming a force of 700 fighters into the equivalent of 3,500 to 5,600 fighters through efficient allocation. The irony of Chain Home was that its supposed weaknesses were actually strengths. The long wavelengths that experts said were unsuitable actually propagated farther than shorter wavelengths, achieving detection ranges impossible with shorter waves. The tall towers that seemed impractical actually provided the antenna height necessary for long-range detection. The crude electronics that looked primitive were robust and reliable, operating continuously for months without sophisticated maintenance. The system worked precisely because Watt ignored expert advice about what radar should look like and built what actually worked. After the Battle of Britain, Chain Home continued operating throughout the war, detecting V-1 flying bombs in 1944 and providing early warning of conventional bomber raids. The system was gradually supplemented by more sophisticated radars using shorter wavelengths and better resolution. But Chain Home remained the backbone of British air defense until 1945. The last Chain Home station didn't close until 1956, making the impossible system operational for 21 years. Robert Watson Watt received knighthood in 1942 for his radar work, becoming Sir Robert Watson Watt. He continued working on radar development throughout the war, contributing to airborne radar for night fighters and ground-controlled approach systems for aircraft landing. After the war, he worked as a consultant on electronics and radar systems. He died on December 5, 1973, at age 81. Having witnessed his impossible invention become fundamental to modern aviation and defense. The story of Chain Home illustrates that expert consensus about physical limitations can be wrong when it's based on conventional approaches. The experts who said long-range radar was impossible were correct that conventional continuous wave radio couldn't achieve the required performance, but they were wrong to assume that conventional approaches were the only possibilities. Watt's pulse technique bypassed the limitations experts thought were fundamental. The limitations weren't in physics, they were in imagination. Modern air defense systems descend directly from Chain Home. Pulse radar remains the dominant approach for long-range detection. The principles Watt demonstrated, Powerful pulses, tall antennas, directional reception are still fundamental to radar design. Military aircraft still carry radar warning receivers, designed to detect the pulses that Chain Home made famous. The system that violated 1935 physics understanding established principles that remain valid 90 years later. February 1935 was when Watson Watt proposed radar that experts said violated physics. June 1935 was when his prototype detected aircraft at 40 miles, when experts said 50 miles was impossible. December 1935 was when detection range exceeded 100 miles, thoroughly demolishing expert predictions. September 1940 was when Chain Home detected every German raid during the Battle of Britain, providing the early warning that allowed 2,900 RAF pilots to defeat 2,600 Luftwaffe aircraft. September 15, 1940, was when the system detected two major raids, enabled interception of 350 German aircraft, and helped shoot down 60 bombers. 1956 was when the last Chain Home station closed after 21 years of operation that experts said couldn't work for 21 minutes. One engineer, one impossible proposal, one system that violated expert. Understanding 240-mile detection range when 50 miles was supposedly maximum, 100% detection of major raids, saved Britain from invasion, proved that crude and simple beats elegant and impossible, not because it followed the physics experts understood, because it followed physics the experts hadn't imagined. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of impossible inventions that worked anyway. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who built what experts said couldn't exist. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.